This is a bit of reflection on some play and the general nature of the game The Clay That Woke by Paul Sega, which is here. And my take on this begins with a comment from a friend of mine who shall remain nameless, but I really, really enjoy playing games with him. And I suggested, hey, let's get together a game of The Clay That Woke, and he reacted fairly strongly and said, I really don't like all these games about feelings. I don't like feelings mechanics. I don't like, delving into all this feeling stuff. And I was a little surprised considering the person who, as far as I can tell, plays very passionately. But this isn't really about him. This is about the reaction about the game. And the same thing kind of goes for other reactions I've observed that primarily are referring to the mechanics and the setting and really anything which is always tagged as weird. That this is a different game, that this is something where you go off into some weird space and you play differently and you're supposed to address the whole thing differently, and the whole thing is just this weirdness that's over there. And if you role play over here, and then if you want to go do that weird thing over there with that game, I guess you can. Well, this is very strange to me as well. And this is kind of a strange perception of the game because, not to put too fine a point on it, this is a game about choosing a character class, playing a badass, and leveling up in a cool setting with lots and lots of layers that develop through play. Kind of having a hard time seeing how that's not what most people say they're looking for when they roleplay, especially in reference to certain other games. Well, having acknowledged this kind of disconnected perception of the game, what is it and what have I recently done with it? I'll start with the latter. So we played at Spielen's Hus with people whom viewers would recognize if we had recorded it. They include William and Nate and Mika, sometimes known as Tintin. So 3 pretty ready for anything kind of folks. And I handed out the character sheets, which you don't do anything to. You just pick which sheet you want. They have types. And then you're ready to go. You're looking at the sheet. You need just the tiniest bit of orientation about the setting, and you're ready to play. So it really is pick up and play for them. There is some role-playing material, some preparation that's involved. It's set out in a rubric, a list, really. Just check off this list and you'll be ready to go too as the game master. And the terminology is thought-provoking. For example, certain characters are called intrinsics, who have weird beliefs or what's called quid pro quo thinking, or both. And you have to kind of think a little bit about what that means. But once you do, you say, oh, you mean an interesting NPC that I'm looking at sideways because I'm not supposed to modernize it or identify with the fact that, they have certain points of view. Okay, got it. So really, it's just situational prep that's wide open for occurrences because the outcomes of resolution are decisive in many ways. Well, what then about this vaunted weird resolution? As I saw yet again in this experience, and I've been through this many times with this game, to the extent where I consider it a go-to game, that the learning curve on the system is immensely short. It looks steep when you're first encounter. You're like, what on earth is this? You do it once, nobody else at the table, not just the person, but no one else at the table has any problem saying, oh, and knowing what to do when they go into some sort of engaging, unpredictable situation. And of course, we are talking about the famous wooden counters, which, as you can see, are pretty cool. These ones are made by Paul because I bought the made ones, and then those got taken at the airport by security along with all my other dice and everything, and I never saw them again. And so I pleaded to Paul, and he made new ones for me, which was really nice because if I made them, all these little stickers would be totally off center on each disc, or wadded up on one side and stuff like that. Well, this one that you're looking at right here is a silence token. And that's a real big deal because that has everything to do with kind of the Minotaur player characters' philosophy that they've been brought up with. And indeed, the character classes themselves are oriented, in most cases, toward some aspect of silence. It's partly interesting. You don't say the names of women, for example. There's a few strictures like that. And then there are other strictures that are very demanding. Strive for justice, but do not want. So all sorts of things. Breaking silence is really traumatic for Minotaurs, and you have a bunch of these silence tokens that you start with, and if you break silence, you're allowed to. The game doesn't say you can't. That's what the Minotaurs think, is that you can't, but you can, and you just lose a silence token. So you can get away with a certain amount of silence breaking. Then there's also the issues of what happens when you run out of silence tokens. Deal with that in a minute. I'm not explaining the whole system here. I'm just pointing out that you have this batch of tokens in front of you. You also have things to do with your courage and your mind, and a variety of other things. But the idea here is that when you are going to do some resolution, you're going to pick up a number of these of your choice, and you're going to toss them into the jar, and the GM will toss some things into the jar too, and then you're going to draw 4. So if you want to be doing something very thinky, then you're going to want to put in mind tokens. If you're doing something very truthy, very insightful, then you're going to be putting in silence tokens. If you want to be doing something physical, basically, or physically courageous and things like that, then you are going to want to put in the courage token. Now, that's great. You don't know how many you're going to get of the ones you put in. The GM is either putting in stops, which are these hands, got a bunch of them lying around here, or skulls, which is death. And so if it's some sort of non-violent situation, you can bet the GM's tossing in a bunch of stops. If it's a very physically violent one, you can bet they're tossing in a bunch of deaths, or some combination, conceivably. But the idea is that all these things go in there and you're drawing out 4. And there is one resolution chart. And again, this is kind of where people get daunted as they take one look at this. This table here. The table is only 2 pages, which is this thing. And so the way it works is that you start at the top left and you just work your way down until you find the tokens that you drew that match to any part of it. And then if you have any tokens left out of the ones you drew, you keep going and see if those match anything that's left. There are things like single skulls and single name tokens and single stops and stuff like that as leftovers that add nuances to what's going on. So you might get a result out of 3 of your tokens, and then you have some leftover stop token, and you're like, oh, okay, well, since there's a stop token there, that's what it means in addition. So this is all fine, and rather easy. There's a language to it, but it's not really a very hard one. You quickly understand that putting in thinky things, putting in your minds tokens, makes you have clever outcomes. But to find things out, you need silence tokens instead. So people keep trying to investigate with their mind, and all they do is keep on being clever, but they actually don't find anything out until they finally understand the table and go, oh, and then they start going for silence. Anyway, there's also an economy of tokens because, and there's sort of a way to keep from having people just throw in buckets and buckets, because whatever doesn't come out of the jar goes to goes out of play. Goes to the table basically. So all the stops and skulls go back to the game master, and then all the other ones just kind of go into the unused pool. So be careful. You're going to be losing things if you put in your life token. You got 1 life token to start. Put in one of your life token, which sometimes you want to. you might want to have more than one life token, because if it doesn't come back to you, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So there's a few things like that. Now, what makes things tricky for me as a GM is remembering just a few very tiny rules, which I really should remember easily. They're much less difficult than many rules that I follow reflexively in other role playing games. And one of them is that when certain kinds of NPCs are present, then you add silence tokens and a few other things, the silence tokens and name tokens and stuff like that. You toss them in as the GM. And those are things that a player is going to be very happy to be pulling out, especially because of what they pull out, they can keep that. That's the way you get gifts when you're dealing with one of these strange voice things, these entities who are these kind of insane gods. And you're talking to them and you do a draw, it's quite likely that a gift is going to come out for you because gift tokens go in there when they're involved. So that's kind of cool that you get things this way, that you if someone else, another Minotaur, was helping you and threw some things in there for you, then whatever comes out, you choose who gets what out of the ones, you and those who helped you. There's a certain amount of manipulation of the tokens that still, it's random enough that you are basically reacting to what's going on rather than strategizing for that from the start, to any certain degree anyway. So, as I say, it sounds kind of funky, but in play, it's extremely easy. You say, what am I trying to do? Oh, and you grab the right tokens and you throw them in and see what comes out. The table will help you, and it's actually extremely usable, and moves things along, fast.